Welcome to Shadow Storyteller. If you enjoy true tales of the unexplained, do not forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below for more bedtime stories that linger long after the lights go out. It was the winter of 2017 in the quiet town of Elkhorn, Nebraska, a place where the wind howled through cornfields long harvested, and streetlights flickered under the weight of snow-laden clouds. The date was January the 12th, just past midnight, when the air inside 19-year-old Corwin Vale's bedroom grew unnaturally still. Not a single creak from the old floorboards. Not a whisper from the wind outside his window. Only a thick, suffocating silence that pressed against his eardrums like cotton soaked in ice water. Corwin had always been a light sleeper. He blamed it on the years spent in his grandmother's creaking farmhouse, where every shadow seemed to breathe and every draft carried a name. That night, however, sleep came quickly, too quickly, after a long shift at the local feed store. He remembered pulling the wool blanket up to his chin, the scent of wood smoke clinging to the sheets from the evening's fire, and then, nothing. Until he woke. Or rather, until his mind woke, but his body did not. He could feel his chest rising and falling, shallow and rapid, as though his lungs were fighting invisible hands. His eyes fluttered open, but the room was darker than it should have been. The digital clock on his nightstand, usually glowing a soft green, was dead. Outside, the moon had vanished behind a bank of clouds so dense they seemed to swallow light itself. Then he saw it. At the foot of his bed, just beyond the reach of what little ambient glow filtered through the curtains, stood a figure. Tall, impossibly thin. Its shoulders hunched slightly forward, as if bearing the weight of something ancient and unseen. It had no face, not in the way one might expect a mask or shadow to obscure features, but a smooth, blank expanse where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. Yet Corwin knew, with a certainty that chilled his marrow, that it was watching him. Not moving, not breathing, just waiting. A cold sweat broke across his forehead. He tried to scream, to kick, to even twitch a finger, but his limbs were stone. His breath hitched in his throat, sharp and desperate, but no sound escaped. Time stretched, warped, as if the seconds themselves were afraid to pass. The figure remained motionless, yet Corwin felt its presence creeping closer, sliding over the bed like smoke through a crack in the door. Memories flashed, half-formed nightmares from childhood, warnings whispered by his grandmother about the watcher in the corners, a superstition she'd picked up from her Lakota neighbors decades ago. He'd always dismissed them as folklore. Now, trapped between wakefulness and paralysis, folklore felt terrifyingly real. Minutes passed, or perhaps only seconds. The distinction blurred in the suffocating dark. Then, with a suddenness that made his heart lurch, the figure tilted its head. Just slightly. Like a predator considering whether its prey is worth the effort. A low hum filled the room. Not audible in the usual sense, but felt. A vibration in the bones, a resonance in the teeth. Corwin's vision blurred at the edges. His thoughts fragmented. He could smell ozone, sharp and metallic, like the air after lightning strikes dry earth. And beneath it, something older, damp soil, burnt sage, the faint tang of iron. Then, as abruptly as it had appeared, the pressure lifted. His fingers twitched. His toes curled. Air rushed into his lungs with a gasp so loud it echoed off the walls. He scrambled upright, blankets tangling around his legs, eyes darting wildly around the room. The figure was gone. The clock flickered back to life. 1:17 a.m. The wind returned outside, rattling the panes with a familiar, almost comforting rhythm. But Corwin did not sleep again that night. In the days that followed, he spoke to no one. Not his co-workers at the feed store. Not his few friends from high school. Who would believe him? Sleep paralysis, they'd say. Stress. An overactive imagination. But Corwin knew what he'd felt. What he'd seen. And what unsettled him most was not the figure itself, but the certainty that it had been there before. That it had watched him many times, silently, patiently, while he dreamed unaware. Weeks later, while sorting through his grandmother's attic after her passing, he found a small leather-bound journal tucked beneath a stack of yellowed quilts. Inside, on a page dated March of 1963, she had written, "He came again last night. tall as the doorframe, blacker than the space between stars. I could not move, could not cry out, but I knew his name, and he knew mine. Below it, in shaky script, she had drawn a symbol, a circle bisected by a jagged line, like a lightning bolt frozen mid-strike. Corwin never saw the figure again after that winter night. But sometimes, when the wind howls just right through the empty fields outside Elkhorn, or when the power flickers during a storm, he feels that silence return, that heavy waiting quiet. And he knows, somewhere beyond the veil of sleep, the watcher is still there, waiting, watching, remembering. Weeks turned into months, and Corwin Vale tried to convince himself it had all been a fluke, an extreme episode of sleep paralysis, nothing more. He threw himself into work at the feed store, volunteered at the local animal shelter, even started jogging along the gravel roads outside Elkhorn just to tire himself out before bed. Anything to keep his mind from wandering back to that frigid January night. But the silence followed him. Not the ordinary quiet of a rural town, that gentle hush of crickets and distant coyotes, but a deeper, more deliberate stillness. It crept in when he least expected it, while brushing his teeth, while flipping pancakes on a Sunday morning, even in the middle of conversations. A split-second pause as if the world itself held its breath. And each time, his skin prickled with the same icy dread he'd felt trapped beneath his own body. Then came the dreams. They weren't nightmares in the traditional sense. No blood, no monsters chasing him through endless hallways. Instead, they were scenes, vivid, lucid, and eerily mundane. He'd find himself standing in unfamiliar rooms. A dusty schoolhouse with peeling paint, a hospital corridor lit by flickering fluorescents, a barn with rusted tools hanging from hooks. In each, the same figure waited. Not threatening, not speaking, just present. Watching from the edge of his vision, always just out of focus, as if his mind refused to fully acknowledge its existence. One night in early April, Corwin dreamed of Whispering Pines Asylum. A real place, abandoned since the 1980s, located just 30 miles east of Elkhorn. He'd never been there, yet in the dream he knew every cracked tile, every rusted gurney, every barred window. The air smelled of mildew and something faintly sweet, like rotting flowers. And there, in the center of the old hydrotherapy room, stood the figure. This time it turned fully toward him. Though it still had no face, Corwin felt its attention like a physical weight pressing against his sternum. "You remember?" it seemed to say, not with words but with a thought that bloomed inside his skull like ink in water. He woke gasping, drenched in sweat, his sheets twisted around his legs like restraints. Moonlight streamed through his window, casting long, wavering shadows that danced along the walls. For a moment, he thought he saw one of them detach itself from the rest, stretching upward toward the ceiling. He blinked and it was gone. The next day, on a whim he couldn't explain, Corwin drove to Whispering Pines. The asylum loomed against a gray spring sky, its red brick facade crumbling, ivy strangling its windows like veins. The front gate hung open, rusted hinges groaning in the breeze. Local legend said the place was haunted by the ghosts of patients subjected to cruel experiments in the 1950s. Teens dared each other to spend the night inside. Most ran out screaming before sunrise. Corwin walked through the entrance without hesitation. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. Floorboards groaned underfoot. Water dripped somewhere deep within the building, steady as a heartbeat. He moved through the corridors as if guided by memory, turning left at a collapsed nurse's station, right at a shattered mirror, until he stood in the very room from his dream, the hydrotherapy chamber. Tiles lined the walls in faded blue and white. A rusted metal tub sat in the center, filled with stagnant rainwater. And on the far wall, scrawled in something dark and flaking, perhaps old blood, perhaps rust, was the same symbol from his grandmother's journal, a circle split by a jagged line. His breath caught. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the journal, flipping to the page with the drawing. The resemblance was exact. Not similar. Exact. As if copied by the same hand. That night, back in his bedroom, Corwin placed the journal on his nightstand and lay down fully clothed, staring at the ceiling. He didn't try to sleep. He waited. And at precisely 1:17 a.m., the same time as that first encounter, The air grew still. The figure appeared not at the foot of the bed this time, but standing beside it, close enough that Corwin could feel the absence of warmth radiating from it. It leaned down slowly, its blank face hovering inches from his own. No breath passed between them. No sound. But Corwin felt a flood of images rush into his mind, not his own but someone else's. A woman in a white dress running through cornfields. A man in a military uniform whispering a name into a radio that emitted only static. A child drawing the symbol on the wall of a basement with charcoal. Generation after generation, the same watcher appearing in moments of vulnerability, in thresholds between sleep and waking, life and memory. And then a voice, soft, ancient, resonant, not in his ears but in the space behind his eyes. "I am not your enemy," it said. "I am the keeper of what was forgotten." Corwin for the first time did not feel fear. He felt recognition. He understood now. The figure wasn't haunting him. It was trying to show him something buried deep in his bloodline, in the land itself. His grandmother hadn't been superstitious. She'd been a witness. And now so was he. Over the following months, Corwin began researching his family history in earnest. He visited county archives, interviewed elderly neighbors, even tracked down distant relatives in South Dakota. Piece by piece, a pattern emerged. Every third or fourth generation, someone in his family reported the Watcher. They described it differently: a shadow, a spirit, a guardian, but always during episodes of sleep paralysis, always accompanied by the same symbol, always tied to moments of emotional rupture or ancestral trauma. He learned that his great-great-grandfather, a Civil War veteran named Elias Vale, had been treated at Whispering Pines in its earliest days, not as a patient but as staff. He documented strange occurrences in his own journal. Patients speaking in tongues they'd never learned, nurses vanishing for hours only to reappear with no memory, and most chillingly, the man in the corner who watches but never blinks. Elias had drawn the symbol too. Corwin began keeping his own journal. Not out of fear but out of duty. He wrote everything: dreams, sensations, dates, symbols. He stopped fighting the episodes of paralysis. Instead, he learned to stay calm within them, to observe, to listen. And slowly the visits changed. The figure no longer loomed. It stood beside him now like a companion. Sometimes it would point toward a book on the shelf, a photograph in an album, a direction on the map. In the fall of 2018, guided by one such dream, Corwin unearthed a rusted tin box buried beneath the old oak behind his grandmother's house. Inside were letters, photographs, and a small obsidian stone carved with the same jagged circle symbol. The letters spoke of a pact, an agreement between his ancestors and something older than the town, older than the country itself. A promise to remember, to bear witness, to keep the veil thin but intact. He wears the stone now, strung on a leather cord around his neck. It's cold to the touch, even in summer. He still lives in Elkhorn, still works at the feed store. But at night, when the wind stills and the world holds its breath, Corwin doesn't close his eyes in fear. He opens them wide. Because he knows now that sleep is not an escape. It's a threshold. And some doors, once opened, never fully close. By the summer of 2019, Corwin Vale had stopped seeing the figure as an intruder. It had become something else, something closer to a guide though never quite a friend. It never spoke again in words, but its presence carried meaning, like the low hum of a tuning fork pressed against bone. He began to notice patterns not just in his own life, but in the town itself. Strange coincidences, unexplained silences. The way some neighbors would glance at their windows at precisely 1:17 a.m., as if expecting something. He started walking the edges of Elkhorn at dusk, notebook in hand, recording anomalies. Streetlights that flickered in sequence, not randomly. Crows gathering on the same power line every third Thursday. A child's drawing left on the bench outside the post office. 3 stick figures, one tall and featureless, standing between the other 2. The child, when asked, claimed she'd never drawn it. One evening, while sitting on the porch of the abandoned Sinclair house, its windows boarded, its porch swing swaying without wind, Corwin felt the familiar pressure building in his chest. Not full paralysis this time, but the prelude. a heaviness in his limbs, a narrowing of sound. He didn't resist. He leaned back in the creaking wicker chair and let it come. The world dimmed. When his vision cleared, he was no longer on the porch. He stood in a field of tall prairie grass, golden under a setting sun that cast no shadow. In the distance, a lone cottonwood tree stood silhouetted against the horizon. Beneath it sat a woman in a faded calico dress, her back to him. Her hair was braided with dried sage and sweetgrass. She turned slowly, and Corwin recognized her instantly, Maeve Vale, his great-grandmother, who died in 1942, long before he was born. She didn't speak. She simply held out her hand. In her palm rested the obsidian stone. He reached for it, and the dream shattered. He woke on the porch, the wicker chair damp with dew, the sky streaked with dawn. The stone still hung around his neck, but now it felt warmer, as if charged with memory. That same day, he drove to the county cemetery and found Maeve's grave, half hidden beneath overgrown yarrow. At its base, someone had placed a small bundle of dried sage, recently, judging by the color. No name. No note. Just the offering. He knelt and pressed his palm to the earth. The soil was cool, but beneath it, something pulsed, faint, rhythmic, like a slow heartbeat. Word began to spread in whispers. Not about hauntings, but about Corwin. How he seemed to know things. When old Mrs. Henley's well would run dry, when the storm would break before the forecast said so, which missing dog would return and from which direction. People didn't call him strange. They called him the quiet one who listens. Some left jars of jam or handwritten notes on his doorstep. Others simply nodded when they passed him on the street, as if sharing a secret neither dared speak aloud. Then came the letter. It arrived in early October, postmarked from Rapid City, South Dakota. No return address. Inside a plain envelope was a single sheet of paper, yellowed at the edges, covered in neat cursive. Read. If you've seen the Watcher, then you've been chosen. Come to the standing bare ridge before the first snow. Bring the stone. Tell no one. Beneath the message was the symbol, circle, jagged line, drawn in what looked like charcoal. Corwin didn't hesitate. He packed a duffel bag with warm clothes, dried food, his grandmother's journal, and a recorder. He left a note on his door saying he'd be gone a few days, visiting family. At dawn, he drove west, the plains giving way to rising hills, then jagged bluffs carved by ancient rivers. Standing Bear Ridge wasn't on most maps. It was a place known only to the Lakota and those few settlers who'd married into the knowledge. He arrived as dusk painted the sky in violet and burnt orange. At the summit, a figure waited, tall, wrapped in a wool coat, face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. It was a woman, perhaps in her late 60s, with silver braids and eyes that held the depth of winter lakes. She didn't introduce herself. She simply said, "You're late." Corwin nodded. "I didn't know I had a schedule." She smiled faintly. "The Watcher doesn't work on clocks. But the land does." She led him to a ring of stones half buried in the earth, older than the United States, older than the trails that crossed it. In the center stood a flat slab of granite, etched with dozens of the same symbol, layered over centuries. The woman placed her hand on it, then gestured for Corwin to do the same. When his fingers touched the stone, the world dissolved. Images flooded him, not dreams, not memories, but truths. He saw the first Vale arrive in Nebraska in 1853, fleeing debt and shame, only to be found half dead in a blizzard by a Lakota healer who taught him the old ways. He saw pacts made not in blood, but in silence, agreements to guard the thin places where the veil frayed. He saw the Watcher not as a spirit, nor demon, nor ghost, but as a sentinel, a remnant of something that existed before names, before borders, before time was measured in years. "It's a guardian," the woman said, her voice cutting through the vision. "But it needs a vessel. Someone to remember. Someone to stand between." Corwin understood then why his grandmother had written in her journal. Why his great-grandfather had documented the asylum. Why the stone had found its way to him. He wasn't being haunted. He was being initiated. The woman, whose name he later learned was Lila Red Hawk, stayed with him through the night, teaching him rituals, songs without words, ways to ground himself during the visits. "You don't command it," she warned. You listen. And sometimes you say no. By morning, the first snow began to fall. Corwin returned to Elkhorn changed, though no one could say how. He still worked the same job. Still lived in the same house. But now, when the stillness came, he met it with open eyes. He no longer woke gasping. He woke knowing. In the years that followed, others began to appear at his door, quietly, carefully. A teenager from Omaha who couldn't sleep without seeing a shadow at the edge of her room. A trucker from Iowa who heard whispers through his radio on long desert stretches. A librarian from Lincoln who kept dreaming of a library that didn't exist, filled with books that bore her name. Corwin never turned them away. He listened. He shared what he knew. He gave them the stone to hold when the fear grew too loud. And sometimes, when the moon hung low and the wind stilled just so, he would stand on his porch and look out over the sleeping town, feeling not alone but connected, to the land, to the past, to the silent watcher that walked the border between worlds. He still doesn't know its name. But sometimes in the quietest hour before dawn, he thinks it knows his. Winter returned to Elkhorn with a quiet fury in the year 2021. Snow fell not in flakes, but in thick, relentless sheets that buried fences, swallowed roads, and turned the world into a hushed monochrome. Power lines sagged under the weight of ice. The feed store closed early most days. People stayed indoors, stoking stoves and watching the horizon through frosted panes. But Corwin Vale walked the white expanse each evening, boots crunching over drifts, breath curling in spirals before vanishing into the dark. He wasn't alone. Not in the way others might mean. No human companion trudged beside him. But he felt it, the presence, keeping pace just beyond the edge of sight. It no longer appeared only in sleep or paralysis. It moved with him now, a silent twin in the landscape, its form shifting with the light. A distortion in falling snow, a deeper shadow beneath the oak, a stillness in the wind where motion should be. And the visitors kept coming. One frigid night in February, a man arrived at Corwin's door, 30-something, hollow-eyed, wearing a parka 2 sizes too large. His name was Darian Moss, and he'd driven from Cheyenne with nothing but a thermos of coffee and a notebook filled with sketches of a faceless figure standing over hospital beds, motel rooms, back seats of cars. "It's been with me since my brother died," he said, voice raw. "Not right after. Months later. Like it waited." Corwin made tea. They sat by the wood stove, the fire casting long, leaping shadows that neither flinched from. Darian spoke of waking unable to move, of feeling cold fingers brush his temple, of hearing his brother's voice murmur, "It's not here for you. It's here because you're awake." That phrase, "because you're awake," echoed in Corwin's mind for days. He began to wonder, was the watcher drawn only to trauma? Or to awareness? To those who, through grief or solitude or sheer stubborn curiosity, had cracked open the ordinary and glimpsed what lay beneath? He posed the question to Lila Red Hawk during their monthly calls. She laughed softly, the sound like dry leaves skittering over stone. "You think it chooses the broken?" she said. "No. It chooses the listening. Trauma cracks the shell, yes. But it's the ear pressed to the fissure that matters." Her words stayed with him. He started keeping a new kind of journal, not just recording encounters but mapping them. Dots on a county map connected by thread. Omaha, Sioux City, Grand Island, even as far as Denver and Des Moines. All places where people reported the same thing. A figure, featureless, tall, appearing during sleep paralysis, always at the same hour, between 1 and 2 in the morning, most often at 1:17. Always accompanied by that silence, that pressure, that scent of ozone and earth. And always, eventually, the symbol. Some drew it in dreams. Others found it scratched into mirrors, etched into car windows, written in steam on bathroom glass. One woman in Lincoln claimed she woke to find it carved into the skin of her forearm. Not bleeding, not raised, just there, as if it had always been part of her. Corwin began to suspect it wasn't just a marker. It was a key. In March, during a thaw that turned the fields to mud and the roads to sludge, Corwin received a package with no return address. Inside was a wooden box lined with red velvet. Nestled within lay a second stone, larger than his own, smooth as river glass, carved with the symbol on one side and on the other, a single word in Lakota. heighten meaning to remember together. Tucked beneath it was a faded photograph. It showed a group of people standing in front of a church in Elkhorn, dated 1938. Among them stood his great-grandmother Maeve, and beside her, a man Corwin didn't recognize, tall and lean, wearing a dark suit and no hat. His face was turned slightly away from the camera, but his silhouette, it matched. Corwin's breath caught. He called Lila immediately. She was silent for a long moment after he described the photo. Then she said, "That man wasn't human." "Not entirely. My grandmother spoke of him. They called him the Threshold Keeper. He walked among your line for generations, appearing only to those who could see the veil. He wasn't haunting you, Corwin. He was reminding you." "Reminding us of what?" Corwin asked. "Of the pact," she replied. "Not to fear the in-between. To hold the door open just enough, to let memory pass through but not the chaos." That night, Corwin placed both stones on his nightstand. He lay down and waited. At 1:17 a.m. the air stilled. The figure appeared not at the foot of the bed, not beside it, but sitting cross-legged on the floor, facing him. For the first time it held something in its hands, a small pouch made of deerskin. It extended it toward Corwin. He reached out. The moment his fingers brushed the leather, warmth spread through his arm, then his chest, then his mind. Visions bloomed, not chaotic but ordered, like pages turning in a sacred text. He saw his ancestors not as isolated figures, but as links in a living chain. He saw the land not as property but as memory made solid, every hill, every creek, every stone holding stories. And he saw the Watcher not as separate, but as a reflection, the part of himself that had always known, even when he refused to listen. When the vision faded, the pouch remained in his hand. Inside were seeds, dry, black, unfamiliar. Lila identified them over the phone the next day. Wild bergamot used in old protection rituals and devil's claw for grounding. "Plant them at the four corners of your property," she instructed. "And one in the center. It's time." He did as she said. Within weeks, green shoots pushed through the thawing earth. By summer, the plants bloomed, purple flowers swaying in the breeze, roots digging deep into the soil of promises long kept. People still came. Not many, just enough. And Corwin never turned anyone away. He'd offer tea, listen without judgment, and sometimes, if the visitor's eyes held that particular kind of knowing, the kind that came from staring into the dark and not blinking, he'd press the obsidian stone into their palm and say, "Hold this. Breathe. You're not alone." In the fall of 2023, Corwin stood on the ridge overlooking Elkhorn at sunset. The air was crisp, the sky streaked with gold and rose. Behind him, the Watcher stood silent, no longer a silhouette, but almost solid, its edges softened by the dying light. He didn't speak. Neither did it. But in that stillness, something passed between them. Not a message, not a command, but a continuation. A quiet understanding that the work wasn't done. That the veil would always fray. That someone would always need to stand in the gap. And for now, that someone was him. He turned and walked back down the hill, boots scuffing through dry grass. The wind picked up, rustling the bergamot near his porch. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle blew, long and low, carrying its sound across the plains like a lullaby for the awake. He knew the Watcher would be waiting when he closed his eyes tonight. And for the first time in his life he looked forward to it. By the spring of 2024, Corwin Vale had stopped counting the number of visitors who came to his doorstep. They arrived like moths drawn to a steady flame, quiet, hesitant, often shivering not from cold, but from the weight of something they couldn't name. He never asked for their life stories. He simply opened the door, poured a cup of tea, and waited. Most spoke within minutes. Others sat in silence for hours until the presence in the room, the one they'd all felt but never understood, made itself known in the stillness between breaths. It was during this time that Corwin began to notice a shift not just in himself, but in the town. Elkhorn had always been quiet, but now it carried a different kind of quiet. One layered with awareness. Old Mr. Hargrove at the hardware store started leaving bundles of sage and sweetgrass by the register, for those who need it. The high school librarian began stocking books on Lakota cosmology and dream interpretation, claiming kids are asking. Even the local diner, May's Corner, added a new special to its chalkboard every month. Threshold pie, a blackberry lavender concoction with a flaky crust, served only after sunset. No one questioned it. They just ate it, and sometimes afterward they slept without nightmares. Corwin didn't take credit. He knew the change wasn't his doing. It was the land stirring. The pact renewing itself through the people who lived on it. Then came Maya Ellery. She arrived on a rain-slicked evening in late April, her pickup truck rattling down Corwin's gravel drive like it was held together by hope and duct tape. She was in her early 30s, with storm-gray eyes and hands calloused from years of restoration work. A historic preservationist by trade, she'd been sent by the state to assess the structural integrity of Whispering Pines Asylum, part of a failed redevelopment plan that had died in committee years ago. But she hadn't come just for the building. "I've been seeing him since I was 8, she said, standing on his porch, rainwater dripping from the brim of her hat. "Only I didn't know he was the same one others saw. I thought he was mine alone." Corwin invited her in. Over steaming mugs of nettled tea, Maya described how the figure had appeared to her during fevers, car accidents, breakups, always in moments when she felt untethered from herself. "He never scared me," she admitted, staring into her cup. "He just anchored me, like a hand in the dark saying, 'You're still here.'" That night, for the first time, the Watcher appeared to two people at once. Corwin and Maya sat in the living room, talking softly about memory and place, when the air thickened. The lamp on the side table dimmed. Outside, the rain stopped mid-fall, drops hanging suspended in the porch light like glass beads. And there, between the armchair and the bookshelf, the figure stood. Maya didn't flinch. She exhaled slowly as if greeting an old friend. "He's clearer with you," she whispered. Corwin nodded. "He's been waiting for someone else to see him." From that night on, Maya stayed. Not as a guest. Not as a lover, at least not yet. But as a witness, another set of eyes, another voice in the chorus of the remembering. She brought her knowledge of architecture, of how buildings hold time in their beams and foundations. Together they returned to Whispering Pines not as explorers but as caretakers. They cleared debris, stabilized rotting floors, and in the hydrotherapy room, they placed a small offering, a bowl of creek water, a braid of sweetgrass, and both obsidian stones. The asylum didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt awake. As summer deepened, Corwin and Maya began documenting their findings, not for publication but for preservation. They recorded oral histories from elders in nearby towns, cross-referenced land deeds with tribal records, and mapped locations where the symbol had appeared over the last century. They discovered that many of these sites aligned with ancient ceremonial grounds, old crossroads, or places where violence had been buried but never healed. The Watcher, they realized, didn't appear randomly. It appeared where memory pooled, where the past hadn't been laid to rest but merely covered over. In August, during the Perseid meteor shower, Corwin and Maya drove to Standing Bear Ridge. Lila Red Hawk met them there, her face lined with age but her eyes sharp as ever. She carried a hide drum and a pouch of tobacco. Without a word, she began to sing, a low, wordless chant that seemed to rise from the earth itself. As the first meteor streaked across the sky, Corwin felt the stones in his pocket grow warm. The Watcher stood at the edge of the ridge, silhouetted against the stars. This time it raised one hand, not in warning but in acknowledgement. Lila stopped singing. "It's not just your line anymore," she said, her voice rough with emotion. "It's hers too. And others will come. The circle is growing." Corwin looked at Maya, who met his gaze with quiet certainty. Back in Elkhorn, they converted the old sunroom into a quiet space, a place for visitors to rest, to speak, to simply be. They lined the shelves with journals, stones, dried herbs, and small hand-thrown bowls filled with creek water from different parts of the state. No signs, no rules, just an open door and a kettle always on the stove. One September evening, as the first amber leaves began to fall, a young boy knocked on the door. He couldn't have been more than 10. He stood barefoot on the porch, clutching a crumpled drawing. On it was the symbol drawn in red crayon, and beside it, a stick figure with no face. "My mom says I talk in my sleep," he said, eyes wide. And I keep waking up scared. But not of him. Of forgetting. Corwin knelt. You won't forget, he said gently. Not as long as you're willing to remember. He gave the boy a small stone, smooth, uncarved, and taught him how to hold it when the night grew too quiet. Later, as Maya washed dishes and the boy slept curled on the couch beneath a quilt stitched by Corwin's grandmother, the watcher appeared once more. It stood in the corner of the kitchen, watching not Corwin, not Maya, but the sleeping child. And for the first time, Corwin saw something in its posture he'd never noticed before. Tenderness. Not human. Not emotional in the way people understand it, but a deep, ancient care, the kind a mountain might feel for the streams that carve its sides, or a tree for the roots that anchor it through storms. He understood then that the watcher wasn't bound to his bloodline. It was bound to the act of remembering itself. As long as someone was willing to stand in the gap between sleep and waking, between past and present, between fear and understanding, the watcher would remain, not to frighten, not to test, but to remind. You are not alone. You have never been alone. The seasons would turn. Visitors would come and go. Some would carry the knowledge back into their own lives. Others would return again and again, drawn by the quiet certainty that here, in this unremarkable Nebraska town, something sacred was being tended. And Corwin Vale, alongside Maya, alongside Lila, alongside every soul who'd ever woken in the stillness and dared to look, would keep the door open. Not to let the dark in, but to remind the world that even in the deepest silence, someone is listening. Years passed. The quiet grew deeper. The visits became fewer, not because the watcher left, but because the need for its presence faded. Corwin and Maya grew older. The sunroom filled with journals from those who came before, their pages yellowing, their words whispering from the shelves like dry leaves in wind. Newcomers still arrived, but less often, and always with the same hushed reverence. Life in Elkhorn settled into a rhythm that felt almost ordinary, except to those who knew how to listen. Then, in the late autumn of 2032, Corwin began to forget. At first it was small things. He'd misplace his keys, forget a name, stare at the symbol carved into his stone as if seeing it for the first time. Maya noticed, of course. She'd gently guide him back, touch his hand, say, "Remember the ridge. Remember the stones." And he would, fleetingly, before the memory slipped through his fingers like smoke. The watcher still came, but now it stood farther away, near the window, near the door, as if giving him space. Or as if it too sensed the change. One night in November, just after his 50th birthday, Corwin woke at 1:17 a.m. to an empty room. No pressure. No stillness. No figure. Just silence. True, ordinary silence. He sat up, heart pounding not with fear, but with a strange, hollow dread. He reached for the obsidian stone on his nightstand. It was cold. Lifeless. He called out, "Are you still there?" No answer. The next morning he told Maya. She frowned, touched the stone, then her own chest where she wore a matching one. "It's not gone," she said. "It's waiting." But Corwin wasn't so sure. Days turned into weeks. He tried to keep the space open, to welcome visitors, to maintain the rituals. But his mind, once sharp as flint, now blurred at the edges. Names melted together. Dates dissolved. Even the symbol began to feel unfamiliar, as if it belonged to someone else's story. Then, on the first night of December, everything changed. Maya woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway, slow, deliberate, unhurried. She called Corwin's name. No reply. She got up, wrapped in a wool shawl, and followed the sound to the sunroom. The door was ajar. Inside, Corwin stood before the shelves of journals, his back to her. He was perfectly still. Too still. "Corwin," she whispered. He turned. His eyes were open. But they were empty, glassy, distant, like windows into a house with no lights on. In his hand he held not his stone, but a journal she didn't recognize. Its cover was black, seamless, as if made of shadow itself. "Corwin, what's wrong?" she asked, stepping closer. He smiled. A slow, unfamiliar stretch of lips that didn't reach his eyes. "He's not gone," Corwin said, voice flat, toneless. "He's here." Maya froze. That wasn't Corwin's voice. It was deeper, older, layered with something that didn't belong to this world. "Who's here?" she asked, though she already knew. Corwin tilted his head just slightly, the same way the Watcher used to. "The one who remembers for you," he said. Behind him, the shadows in the corners of the room deepened. Not moving, not advancing, just thickening. As if the darkness itself was pooling, coalescing, taking shape. Maya backed away, hand clutching her stone. It burned hot against her skin. She called Corwin's name again. Real Corwin. The man she loved. The man who'd held space for the lost, who'd listened in the silence, who'd taught children to remember. But the figure before her only smiled wider. And then it spoke, not with Corwin's mouth, but with 100 voices layered into one, whispering from the walls, the floor, the very air. "We never needed you to remember. We only needed you to forget, so we could step in." The last thing Maya saw before the lights went out was Corwin's body turning fully toward her. Not walking but gliding. His limbs too smooth, his posture too tall, too thin. And on the wall behind him, drawn in something dark and glistening that hadn't been there a moment before, was the symbol. Only this time the jagged line had grown, branching like veins, splitting the circle into fragments. As if something had broken through. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the cornfields. Inside, the house fell silent. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of something ancient finally wearing a face it no longer needed to hide. And in towns across the Midwest, in Omaha, in Des Moines, in Rapid City, people began waking at 1:17 a.m., gasping, drenched in sweat, certain they'd just seen someone they knew standing at the foot of their bed. Only, it wasn't quite them anymore.